first of all, this event and the Ayn Rand Center in general are funded by the Prometheus Foundation, Carl Barney's organization, so I want to thank him, and I want to thank our local donors as well and our volunteers. You know, we wouldn't be able to do this without them. Now, before we go into the next panel, does anybody here, we were talking about smoking before, does anybody here smoke? And cigarettes, tobacco. Yeah. Just you, really. And do you think it's good for your health, or do you not think there are any?
I'll tell you what
yeah. Well, so if you look at a pack of cigarettes, you have a warning here. You have, I don't know if it's a picture of this. Oh, didn't know that. Good thing they have the labels, the warnings. There's warnings on the side, on both sides, you know, on the back. And like there were warnings when I was growing up, but they were much smaller, and they kept getting bigger and bigger. You know, politicians were telling us that this is bad for us, and some people still smoked. And politicians, I guess, they couldn't understand it, so they had to make the labels bigger and bigger, so we figure it out and put it on every single side. I mean, if I have a conversation with somebody and I say something pretty simple, you know, like smoking increases the risk of blindness, and I say it loudly and I repeat it, and then I repeat it again, and then I repeat it again, you're going to think that I think that you're stupid, and I probably do if that's how I talk. And this is I think this symbolizes politicians talking down to us, you know, in more than anything else. You know, we have warnings on other things. We have, you know, being told to have our 5 a day, and we're getting, you know, our sugary drinks are getting taxed because, you know, we need those 2% just to figure out that it's bad for us. Yeah, this is, you know, this is the way politicians think of their role. You know, we are all stupid, but that's a good thing, because we have these great politicians who are going to, you know, do our thinking for us. So yeah, we are here to discuss the topic, but I didn't want to, you know, pretend like there is no, you know, clear stance on our side. And our two speakers will elaborate on that. So our speakers are Craig Biddle. He is the editor of the Objective Standard magazine, which you can get here, and he is the author of Loving Life, The Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts That Support It. And Christopher Snowdon, he is the editor of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the author of several books. I think Killjoys was that the last one. Yeah. So please check that out, and please welcome our speakers.
Do we need to use this?
I think
yeah,
You just leave it on the stage.
Yeah.
Live stream, see.
Yeah.
Who's going to go first?
I'll go first if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So, welcome and thank you all for coming. I want to start this discussion on a really positive note, because I noticed that the title of this discussion is The Advertising Wars, Ethics, Culture, and Politics. But it's really a bit perverse, and I'm not blaming the people who named the event or promoted it this way, but it's a bit perverse that we have to even think of advertising as having anything to do with war. Advertising is, if you think about what advertising is in the grand scheme of things, in economics in particular, advertising is a portion of the production side of the economic system of a free market. What happens in a free market is people think about products that might be of value to other people. And then if they decide to go forward with that product, they produce the product, and then once the product exists, they need to let people know that the product exists. Otherwise, it would just sit on the shelf. I mean, if I produce some kind of a new drug to help people with asthma, so a new asthma inhaler, and we produce it and then we put it on the shelf, so I've done some production, And let's say you have asthma, and you don't know that this drug exists. Well, how are you going to find out? It could save your life. It could certainly improve your life, and you don't know it exists yet. So the job of the advertiser is to produce, this is more production, is to produce information and get it out there so that people know that this value exists so that you can then buy it. And that brings us to the third part of the economic system. So you've got production, and then you've got consumption, which is what you're trying to do with this product if you get it. And that brings us to the middle part, which is trade, whereby you know about the product, I have it, and now we can engage in trade. And all of this is peaceful. Not only is it all peaceful, it's all good. It's all wonderful. This is exactly what we need to do as human beings if we want to live and prosper. We have to produce values, whether goods or services, whether asthma medication or insoles for shoes or posture correction device of some sort or dance lessons, whatever the case may be. We come up with a good or a service, and then we want to let people know that these things exist and give them information so that they can say, that might be of value to me, or my son could use that, or my friend could use that, or whatever. And that's what advertising is. Advertising is the transmission of information to people in the marketplace so that they can know about the value of a given product so they can decide whether or not they want to buy it. And this is completely peaceful, completely beautiful. It's just a wonderful thing. So I think it's important to have this sort of 30,000-foot level view of what's going on here before we get into the nitty-gritty of all the problems that are associated today, primarily with the government intervention in the economy, but also with people's misunderstanding of what we are as human beings and whether we have free will and whether we can make decisions for ourselves that are good for us. But it's really important, I think, just at the start to realize that people who produce advertisers, they're business people. They're businessmen and women who have said, hey, we want to help people know about this product so that they might buy it and make their lives better. And that's really the essence of what advertising is. That's really what's going on. Now, it's true that somebody can tell lies in an advertisement. They can say, if you buy this product and take this pill, you'll lose 30 pounds in a month, when that's not true. But there are laws against that in all Western reasonably civilized societies. There's laws against fraud. So you don't need extra laws to tell people you can't do that. You already can't do that. It's illegal to do. It's called fraud. It's a fairly straightforward fact. So things will get complicated, and there are a lot of nuances that we're going to get into today. But I think it's really important at the beginning to just realize that advertising is not a war. It's a peaceful transmission of important human values. That's essentially what it is.
Yes, I agree with that. And I mean, there is a war on advertising, especially in this country. We've already heard about Sadiq Khan's ban on so-called junk food advertising on the tube and the trains and the buses, and the government is intending to extend that to all television programs before 9 p.m. in a year or two. There are a lot of people trying to get gambling advertising banned at the moment, particularly during sports events, which is really the obvious place to have gambling advertising, and certainly for bookmakers. And there are a lot of people who like to ban alcohol advertising. That is on top of the ban that we already have had for more than 15 years on tobacco advertising, and indeed on medicines, which, as I mentioned from the floor earlier, is banned for most medicines, apart from over-the-counter medicines. I think one of the problems is the people who, well, there's really only two sets of people who feel very strongly about advertising, and that's people who work in the advertising industry and people who are in single-issue campaigns and hate the advertising for specific products and try and get that banned because they can't actually ban the product or the activity itself. Economists tend not to be very interested in advertising, actually. Julian Simon looked into it, a great economist, Julian Simon, looked into it some years ago, and he concluded, I quote, "The economic study of advertising is not deserving of great attention." And he added that this is not a congenial point at which to arrive after spending several years working on the subject. But his conclusion that it's really not very important in terms of the overall economy, in terms of aggregate sales, which is what economists are generally interested in. It's, of course, very important for businesses who want to shift sales within a particular market. But the main reason economists aren't particularly interested in it is that it doesn't tend to increase the overall market. It just, as the industry would generally tell you itself, it generally just involves encouraging people to switch brands within that particular market. Now, that's the thing that the people who campaign against particular forms of advertising, because they don't like the activity, don't seem to get. And one of the lines that they use all the time, whether it's in relation to gambling or advertising or junk food, is, well, if it didn't work, they wouldn't spend so much money on it. So the very fact that hundreds of millions of pounds are spent advertising alcohol or whatever it may be becomes proof that it must be getting kids to start drinking young or getting people to consume too many calories. But that, of course, misunderstands why they're spending the money in the first place. They are not spending the money, generally speaking, on trying to get non-drinkers to start drinking. They are spending the money trying to get people who drink one brand of beer to drink a different brand of beer. At a push, they might be trying to get people who drink beer to drink wine, possibly, or spirits, but they don't attempt to get non-drinkers to start drinking because they know there's no point to it. They're not trying to get children to start drinking because children generally can't go in a shop and buy it. They are targeting the people they can make money from, which are people who are adults who can buy alcohol from shops and who want to buy alcohol from shops, as evidenced by the fact that they already do so. So there's a basic misunderstanding about how advertising works. And it is based on a rather dim view of the general public, a view of the public that is, in my view, quite patronising and portrays other people as being very susceptible and easily manipulated. You will generally find, if you ask one of these people who is so insistent that people are very easily swayed by an advert in a magazine, what the last thing they bought that they didn't want was, as a result of advertising, they won't be able to come up with something. And you probably will struggle to come up with something yourself. And that's because that's generally not how it works. They don't feel that they themselves are very easily manipulated. It's those other people. It's the people who voted leave because they saw something on the side of a bus. They're the suggestible people. They can't think things through. And therefore we must protect them from the power of advertisers. The reality is actually industry and advertising doesn't have a great deal of power. Most advertising is pretty defensive in actual fact. There's a good deal of game theory to it. Coke advertise because if they don't advertise, Pepsi will keep advertising and they'll soak up all the sales for fizzy drinks. One of the few legitimate economic debates around advertising from over 100 years ago was whether it's basically just inefficient for that reason, that you got two groups of businesses advertising, and essentially both sets of advertising cancels the other out. Therefore, maybe the economy would be more efficient if you got rid of advertising. In the end, economists concluded actually the efficiency gains you get from having more competition as a result of having advertising far outweighs any inefficiencies from advertising. But a lot of advertising is quite inefficient. There's a famous line that half of all money spent on advertising is wasted, but nobody knows which half. It's often quite difficult to track how effective advertising is, but businesses do need to do it because they need to get their message out there. For me, in closing, it's really an issue of free speech. There are huge benefits from advertising, both to the businesses, but mainly to the consumers, including all the people who get free stuff, who get a free copy of the Metro, who get to use Facebook for free, all the incredible variety of free products, commercial television. We all get that. And I think most sensible people see advertising as a necessary evil. They get that they wouldn't receive all these free things were it not for the advertising. And they just sit through the advertising. Every now and again, they'll find an advert that is of use to them. But it's a real issue of free speech. And very much like gambling and alcohol and all the other things that are being targeted in these advertising bans, free speech is under a great deal of threat in this country and further afield. Companies should absolutely have the right to say things that are decent, honest and truthful. And under the Advertising Standards Authority, advertising has to be decent, honest and truthful except for political advertising. The only bit of regulation I would propose is maybe we should start including political advertising. It seems rather more important than that is truthful than adverts for a can of fizzy drink. So it is under threat. People, unfortunately, don't generally fully appreciate all the benefits that advertising brings, And because economists aren't very interested in studying advertising in great detail, because they see not much point in it, the door is left open to a lot of people who hate advertising to come up with a whole load of junk science showing that it's incredibly manipulative and we must ban it in all sorts of different ways. But I don't see these people as any different really to censorious individuals in the past who wanted to censor television programs or rap music lyrics. We don't generally have much sympathy with people like Mary Whitehouse now. We see her quite rightly as a prude who was wrong about things. We don't take seriously the idea that violent video games make people violent, but we do, for some reason, seem to have a very different view when it comes to advertising bacon and cheese on the tube. So there's a weird disconnect where people are much less prudish about traditional things people were prudish about, but suddenly incredibly sensitive about perfectly benign, normal products that are being advertised in a decent and truthful way. So I guess
I'd like to just add something to that. So I agree 100% that advertising is about free speech. I mean, this is communication. That's all advertising is. You're communicating either by means of concepts or by means of images or some combination of those, or maybe using video or whatever. But it's all simply communication. And communication is a good thing. We all have a mind. We each have our own capacity to reason and to choose values and to decide what it is we want to do with our lives and what is going to be important to us. And advertising is a mechanism by which those who produce goods and services can let us know what's available so that we can make a decision. You can't decide to buy something if you don't know it exists. Yet if you do know it exists, you're not forced to buy it by that mere fact. Nor are you forced to buy anything because the model is pretty, or because the model is buff, or because the group of people smoking the cigarettes look happy, right? None of that is coercive. There's nothing, that is not the equivalent of a gun to your head saying you must buy this thing. All it is in each case is information. It's information that might be absolutely factual. For instance, if someone says, if you use this asthma inhaler, it will have this effect on your ability to breathe, and there's literally a causal connection that's just a fact. Or it might be an implied truth or opinion in the case of somebody drinking a Coke and looking happy. And of course, the implication there is if you drink Coke, you too will be happy. Well, that's not an absolute causal connection, but nor is it a lie, because they're not saying that if you drink Coke, you'll be happy. They're showing a happy person drinking Coke. And there's not a human being on this planet, including children who have come to the conceptual age, who can't make that distinction, that merely drinking something is not going to make you happy, right? So there's no way that this can be construed rationally as any kind of coercion. And so the idea that the government has a right to step in and limit free speech on the grounds that your advertisements are somehow forcing people to act against their will, or imposing some discomfort on people that they cannot tolerate, or making young girls feel like if they don't look like a Victoria's Secret model that they are somehow deficient. None of this is true. And I want to go, and since I brought up a controversial subject, and I started this all with how beautiful a thing advertising is, let's just go to the mat on this issue of beautiful models and the effect that this can have on young girls, because this is something that's true. It's real. I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I'm perfectly aware of how a young girl seeing regularly over and over again Victoria's Secret models in ads can have the feeling that that's that doesn't necessarily represent my body, and there can be some sort of a question going on here. Well, a couple things. First of all, beauty is something that is a value. It's a human value. Beauty is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, A. B, health is a good thing. And it is better to be fit, not anorexic, but fit, than it is to be obese. It is also better to be fit than it is to be anorexic. there is an objective standard range within which you are in a healthy zone in terms of your weight, okay? And people should know about that. That's information we should have. It's good information to know that. If you think that it's healthy to be obese, you might just, eat pizza until you're obese and poison yourself into an early death and certainly a less happy existence. Likewise, if you think that being stick thin to the extent that you're going to, make yourself vomit all the time, and become bulimic or anorexic is good, that's really, really unhealthy. So there are facts about human health that create a certain range within which people should objectively try to function. Well, when advertisers show healthy, beautiful women in advertisements, that should not be morally condemned by anyone. That should be praised. Of course, you want to show healthy, beautiful people in advertisements. Why would you show unhealthy or ugly people in advertisements? You're trying to sell goods and services. It would not make any sense to do that. It's just a complete assault on all common sense. But I also want to go to this point particularly about advertisements that portray beautiful people and the kind of effect that might have on young girls. It is not the responsibility of advertisers to make sure that the psychologies of young girls are sound. It is the responsibility of the girl's parents and her teachers and her mentors and herself to understand this. And this is the way that I raised my daughter. I say, look, all of us have our own natural body shape. And they're all different. Look around. We're all shaped a little bit differently. And all of those shapes are perfectly fine. You're born with it. That's what you have. And here's what you want to do with your body shape. Keep it fit. Eat a healthy diet. Keep yourself in good exercise so that you do not become obese and so that you do not emaciate, right? That's the range. And if parents and teachers and other mentors of young girls would tell them that and then say, if you see advertisements with women who you regard as, somehow beautiful or perhaps prettier than you, remember that is, you're looking at a model. That person chose this career because that's what advertisers do. They sell clothing and perfumes and things to other girls, and that's how it sells. That's not an assault on this young girl. It's a fact. And there's not a girl on the planet who can't handle that fact. Here's what the kids don't need. They don't need somebody telling them obesity is just as good as health, any more than they need anybody telling them that anorexia is just as good as health. Be factual with young girls and with young boys and with everyone else. There's not different body types are perfectly good things. And so I think that there's a complete disconnect on who's responsible for what in these kinds of debates. And the idea that Calvin Klein should be responsible for the psychology of this young girl. Now, if Calvin Klein puts anorexic girls in their ads all the time, then rational, sensible people have a moral responsibility, in my view, to look at that and go, that's obscene. I'm not buying Calvin Klein, okay? Or if they put obese women in their ads all the time, and in a pretense that was somehow healthy, I would say the same thing. I would not support that organization. So, the responsibility lies in the marketplace, and it lies with parents. And to the extent that rationality lies with the advertisers, guess what? The marketplace punishes irrationality among advertisers, and it rewards good delivery of healthy, important information. It always has, and it always will. It doesn't mean that somebody can't get away with one campaign that is bad. I think the Gillette ad that just came out was bad. I think there have been some Calvin Klein ads that showed emaciated women. That was a bad move on their part. And I suspect that they suffered to some extent in the marketplace from those. If they didn't, that's not the government's fault and it's not their fault. It's our fault. If you don't like a product or the way that somebody's advertising a product, do not purchase the product. That's the responsibility lies in the marketplace for these things. And it's essential because what's the alternative? that somebody else is going to make our decisions for us about what we can and cannot purchase, what information we can and cannot think about on our own? That's immoral for the government to step in and do that. It's immoral for somebody to tell you what you may or may not hear and what you may or may not say. So there is a moral issue going on here. And the moral issue is that it's immoral for the government to force anybody to speak, to limit their speech. It's immoral for the government to censor speech, whether it's me speaking about what I think is politically correct or what I think about a given product or what I think you should think about a given product, as long as I'm not committing fraud or using physical force against people.
I'd just briefly like to reinforce what you're saying about coercion there. Because all the rhetoric about corporate power and the manipulative power of advertising really is just a smokescreen to disguise the fact that these people want to use real, genuine, tangible coercion in stopping businesses from exercising their commercial speech. I mean, there may be such a thing as corporate power when it comes to lobbying and stuff like that, but not when it comes to advertising. The reality is that businesses are terrified that consumers will abandon them. Consumers are usually pretty fickle. People tend to stick with the same brands out of inertia, but it doesn't take much for them to switch if they have the slightest incentive, and a good advertising campaign or a price drop for a while can very easily do that, and corporations know that. So actually, a lot of advertising is an expression of corporate vulnerability, not of corporate power. There is no way in which advertising, or indeed any form of speech, can be coercive in any meaningful sense, or even manipulative. It can persuade, and that's obviously its intention. It's my intention today to persuade you, but I'm not coercing you or manipulating you. You know, nothing I can say could possibly do that. So yeah, it's a smokescreen for real, genuine coercion. Coercion is a bad thing, but advertising is not it. The coercion comes entirely from the single-issue pressure groups that want to use the law to control what people can say. And we'll go to questions, I think.
Yeah, so we have plenty of time for questions, so we'll have time to follow up as well.
But yeah, if you ask a question, please let the speakers answer and then follow up. Yeah.
First of all, that was amazing, very good, one of the points. Along the lines of the economic terminology you were using at the beginning, I thought it was interesting that you said, and other people think, that advertising is not a concern or something that should be studied from the view of economics, because all of the things that you've been saying sound like negative externalities of advertising industry. It is not the point, it is not a logical conclusion, but women and men who see muscles, women who see thin people are getting like mental health issues because of this, or we are becoming more aware of the fact that mental issues are happening and they are becoming, you know, more obviously linked to advertising. People are more and more aware of that. So I would say that is an economic cost of the advertising industry, and it should therefore have a logical link to be changed by legislation as a result. Just
Well, I'm not sure how strong the evidence is
linking advertising to anorexia. Actually, you may be right. Maybe the evidence is compelling, but if there is a link, it would also apply to, more so in fact, to the fashion industry and probably to Hollywood and all sorts of other industries which use skinny models or skinny actresses or you know, portray that kind of image to people. So I think it would be pretty difficult to quantify the negative externalities if they exist at all. But I wouldn't like to say, you know, whether they even exist in any meaningful sense. I'm not sure how strong the correlation is.
I'd like to say one word on that too. I mean, we have to draw bright lines when it comes to the use of government force, because government force is really destructive. I mean, government force can kill people, it can put people in jail, it can take their money, which is taking their time and their life. So if the government finds you and takes money from you, your corporation or your person, he's taken some of the government has taken some of your life. That's a real assault on you. That's not a trivial matter. So it's extremely important that we draw bright lines about when and when not the government may use force. And the only objective line that you can draw on that is the protection of individual rights, which means the protection of each individual to act on his or her own judgment for his or her own purposes. all right, as long as that individual is not initiating force against someone else. That's what the principle of individual rights is all about. And it's a bright line, it's the correct bright line, where you draw what government may and may not do. So the purpose of government is to protect rights by banning the use of physical force. So you can't use, you can't punch somebody, you can't rape someone, you can't commit fraud, you can't commit extortion. Those are indirect forms of force. Those are all illegal precisely because they're violations of rights, because they're some kind of initiatory force used against individuals. The government bans that properly, and then the government says, we are going to use retaliatory force only against those who initiate its use. And that's the basis of objective law right there. And then the big question is always, has someone initiated force or threatened credibly to do so? That's the force also. Or have they not? Now, in the case of an advertisement that has a model who you might think is too thin or too big, that is not using physical force against anyone. It's not committing fraud unless there is with that a claim that you can demonstrate to be false. Okay? If you can show that somebody advertised a product by claiming that if you use this product you're going to get this thing, and then that's false, that's literally false, then they're trying to gain your money under false pretense. If you give them the money and they give you the product and the product does not do what they said it would do, that's fraud. They've committed indirect force against you. Illegal. That, I'm sure here, I'm not that familiar with your laws over here. In the United States, that's plain and simple. Fraud is illegal. You don't need any extra laws on top of this to work that out. Now, when you're talking about and the reason I keep bringing up the issue of sort of models, being portrayed as or using models that are extremely, extremely thin in the anorexic zone, I think you could make an argument that when a company starts to use clearly anorexic models, that we I'm not saying the government has a responsibility, I'm saying that we as citizens have a moral responsibility to react to that at some point. I think that if you are buying clothing from a company who is regularly using anorexic models, you're contributing to that. Like, that's a real problem. That you have a moral responsibility to stop doing that. You have a moral responsibility to boycott that company. And that's how those things can and are handled in time. So I think that it's a legitimate concern that portraying women in an unhealthy way is not good for other women or for young girls. It's true that if you portray men in an unhealthy way, it's not good for men too. But that's not, as a matter of fact, where people's concerns are today. So I don't want to focus on that. But the main point I want to make is there's got to be a bright line about when government force can be used, and the only objectively demonstrable bright line is the principle of rights. And the reason is quite simple, although quite complex in another sense, but I'll put the simple point out there. The reason you have to be free to act on your judgment is because your judgment is your basic means of living. We all live literally by looking out at the world, using our senses, figuring out what is going to help us and make our lives great, and it's different for everybody. Some people like to play basketball, some people don't. Some people like to take dance lessons, some people like hamburgers, some people like vegetables, whatever. We have to make our own decisions, and the only way you can do that is if you're free to do that. And so that's why that bright line is so important. So that I think your concern is warranted, but just be sure that you don't, by trying to pursue dealing with this concern, you don't cause a bigger problem by inviting the government into the economy. As soon as the government gets its hands in the economy and starts bossing people around and making people do things, the government is violating rights. And that's the worst thing that can happen. So.
I also think, I mean, you mentioned the line. Where do you draw the line? If you take this example, let's go along with the idea that women who see these adverts are somewhat more likely to get into eating disorders, for the sake of argument. There is a big problem with banning speech on the basis that it might make people somewhat more likely to do something that is bad for them. Firstly, because social science will always come up with the evidence for this, and social science is usually pretty sketchy and can be heavily biased by the person conducting it. So the correlation itself may not actually exist. There may not be evidence of causation if it does. But secondly, I mean, there are, I assume, various forums out there, internet forums, people can go on where women encourage others to develop eating disorders. And obviously I disapprove of that, but I don't think they should be banned. There's an argument at the moment about the anti-vaxxers. Now, the anti-vaxxer movement is a dangerous movement, right? People are getting measles and worse as a result of their nonsense. And Matt Hancock recently suggested he was going to put pressure on the social media companies to take down anti-vaxxer propaganda, YouTube clips, and so on. And I think you have to think very carefully about that, because there's all sorts of things that people can say that somebody might consider to be harmful, including probably the things that I'm saying today. Somebody along the line will think, well, Snowdon and the Institute of Economic Affairs are spreading dangerous ideas to young people and it's bad for them, we should shut them up. Where do you draw the line on that? I think in the case of anti-vaxxing and many of these other issues we're discussing today, the solution to bad speech is more speech. And Public Health England, to take this specific anti-vaccination thing, Public Health England has a budget of £4.5 billion, and it seems to spend a lot of it messing around with how much sugar is in biscuits. Seems to me it could get back to doing normal public health work by actually putting out a campaign to debunk a lot of the rubbish that the anti-vaxxer people say. That would be more effective and a better use of their money than probably a doomed attempt to try and get all this stuff off the internet, which is never going to work and is going to drag it underground. Now, that's just one example. But where do you draw the line? Once you start deciding that actually speech is effectively coercive, and the evidence of that is that people are somewhat more likely to do something if people tell them to, I don't see... I mean, I think advertising is a very small part of that debate. I think then you'd be much better off looking at people who are spreading propaganda and actively trying to encourage people to do things that most people would consider to be bad for them.
So you're saying that there's also a lot of evidence that anti-vaxxers are also causing an increase in measles. Like, that's a very strong, obvious correlation with a health impact. And there's evidence to show that. I would also say that there's a lot of evidence to show that mental health issues have increased, and they are as a health issue. Just because they're not physical, and therefore there's not seemingly obvious or visible data on it, they are increasing, and the reasons that are frequently given are campaigns and advertising. So I would say that is sort of disregarding mental health compared to physical health and deaths. Because obviously...
I'm for the sake of argument, I'm going along with the idea that there is a link. But I still don't think it should be banned.
Okay, so there still should be an argument for regulation on this. And it depends where you would say, should anti-vax campaigns be banned, because they are so linked to a higher increase in deaths. Would you say so? Or do you think they should just be regulated or not, or they should be left?
I don't think you can have... I'm not talking about advertising campaigns for anti-vaxxers. I'm talking about YouTube videos and stuff that people, civil society is producing. Yeah, I wouldn't... I mean, an anti-vaxxer advertising campaign would not get past the Advertising Standards Authority because it's not decent, honest, or truthful. So that would, knock that one on the head. The Advertising Standards Authority, I'm sure, would take a pretty dim view of blatantly anorexic women being used in advertising campaigns, and that's why you don't tend to see them. We had the big debate about the beach body thing with Sadiq Khan. People felt, again, it came down to sort of where do you draw the line on that one as well, and that's why it created a debate, because a lot of people thought he went too far, other people thought it was perfectly all right. All I'm saying is that you can find links to all sorts of things from all sorts of forms of speech, and ultimately, I think the best rule is to say
their opinion on that. I think they're wrong, at least if we're talking about vaccinations that are scientifically proven to help fend
But are
off
you talking about
disease.
in advertising campaigns or just generally speaking?
But even in advertising campaigns. So if somebody wanted to, let's say a nonprofit organization comes together. It's not a government organization. It's a nonprofit, and they're the anti-vaxxer nonprofit organization of some sort. And they want to get out the word that they think is true. So they think that vaccinations are problematic and that parents should not vaccinate their children. And so they're going to put up ads, say, about this. And the advertisements are going to say, don't vaccinate your children. Now, I think this is wrong. But this goes to your point. The solution to bad ideas or bad speech is more speech, right? We don't need the government to step in there unless fraud or extortion or some kind of force is being used. You said a couple of times when you were talking just then, where do we draw the line? And that's the question I'm trying to focus on here. Where we draw the line is at force. That's the only viable place to draw the line. It's the only place to draw the line where you don't cause more problems than the problems you're trying to solve. And so I would ask you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but to think about what would be the alternative. So if you don't like people speaking about, or advocating anti-vaccination, or you don't like people using anorexic girls in ads, what would you suppose we should do other than let the marketplace take care of that by means of boycott or ostracization or something like that? Because if you're going to introduce force, then you've stepped over a line. You've stepped over the line that force is not proper for the government to engage in the marketplace. And as soon as you've stepped over that line, you are then on the slippery slope. There's no principle to stop the government from going further into the economy, because the very principle that could have done that is that bright line about individual rights and the use of force. Here's a good way to think about the way that principles work. You can think of a principle as a plateau, right? It's like this. It's the moral high ground. And at the terminus of that plateau is this line, and that's the law of excluded middle. Just bear with me for a second here. And on the other side of that line is a slope, right? The principle is the moral high ground. The principle of individual rights is the proper purpose of government, or protecting individual rights is the proper purpose of government. Here's a principle. You get to this terminus, and as soon as you violate that principle, as soon as you step over that line and say, no, we're gonna let that go just a little bit, then you are on a slope that leads downward to who knows where. There's no way to stop it, because you've already admitted in your own mind, and to anyone else who's advocating this, that it's okay to go past that line. It's okay to violate that principle. But if you maintain that principle, then all of this stuff over here stays out of, you don't have to deal with it. You don't have to deal with the slippery slopes of the problem. This does not solve every problem in human existence, but when you're dealing with government, if you make a bright line about what government's proper purpose is, and you do not step over that line, then you leave the rest of it to the marketplace. And the marketplace isn't going to make everything exactly the way you want it, but nor would government, even if if government does one thing in the marketplace that you like, it might be something that he doesn't like, right? You can't get around anything. You can't get around the fact that we're not always going to be happy with the way that things go. But what you can be happy with is a principle that says no one is allowed to force people to act against their judgment. So that's what I'm advocating.
I think that is where we probably disagree, because I am saying that advertising should be held to a higher standard than normal speech, and that individuals on the internet or anywhere else should be allowed to lie and mislead and say basically whatever they want. Whereas advertising should be, broadly speaking, decent, honest, and truthful, and that requires a regulator. By your logic, if I understand you rightly, you would be okay with a tobacco company advertising a cigarette on the basis it doesn't cause lung cancer.
No, I would not.
What's the difference between that and an anti-vaxxer saying vaccines cause autism?
This gets into a nuance that I'm glad you brought up, because I really wanted to make this point. So there are many products, cigarettes are a really good example of this, that cause problems if they're used a certain way. And then they don't cause problems if they're used another way. And the principle here with cigarettes, at least, is that the poison is in the dose. And this is a really important principle of medicine. If you take a potassium pill of a certain quantity, you're going to poison yourself. Potassium is poisonous, right, at a certain quantity. It's also in bananas. If you eat enough bananas to get enough potassium into your blood to poison you, you're going to get potassium poisoning. But you don't eat that many bananas because, A, you couldn't, but B, you wouldn't if you knew that it was going to poison you. This is why, for instance, we'll go to alcohol. So we all know that alcohol, if you drink too much of it, can really cause problems. It can damage your liver. You can get alcohol poisoning. You could die from alcohol poisoning in just a few hours. You could be toast, okay? But we're aware of that, so we don't drink too much. Well, when it comes to cigarettes, here's a fact about cigarettes. The poison is in the dose. If you smoke a cigarette every month for your life, it's not going to affect you. And there's no study that can demonstrate that it will, that I know of. I mean, I'd be interested to see one if there is, but I can almost promise you that there's nothing of the sort. The poison is in the dose. Here's what's wrong with smoking too many cigarettes. It's just like taking too much of any other chemical that could harm you. If you smoke too many cigarettes, you're flirting with disaster. You're flirting with cancer. You're flirting with lung cancer, and that is a choice that you should not make. It's an immoral choice to make that choice, to do that. So don't do it. But it's wrong to have the government come in and say, well, cigarettes cause cancer, ergo something. Cigarettes don't cause cancer. The choice to smoke too many cigarettes causes cancer. That's what causes cancer. We know cigarettes don't cause cancer because you can rub them all over me and I won't get cancer, right? The cigarettes do not do the causing. What does the causing is the use of the cigarette in a certain way. And so what we all need to recognize is that we are self-responsible agents. We have free will, we have the capacity to think, and we need to use that capacity, A, and we should raise children to use that capacity so that when they get to their teenage years and their adult years, they are not completely helpless feeling people who feel like, oh my God, if I see an ad, it's going to make me do this. That's not true. It's just
that
not
doesn't
true.
answer my question, I think, which is,
Okay.
I'm suggesting that I don't think anyone should be allowed to run an advertising campaign saying the MMR vaccine causes autism. And I don't see how that is any different to a tobacco campaign saying this cigarette won't cause cancer. I mean, you seem to be tolerant of people saying things that are scientifically untrue.
Yeah. No, it definitely would be, I think it would be fraud, given what is scientifically known about cigarettes, to say smoking this cigarette will not cause cancer, because it's quite clear that a certain degree of smoking that cigarette will. So I think you can argue viably that it would be fraud to say that, given what we know about cigarettes. It would also be fraud to say that if you eat, eating, a bottle of vitamin E pills is not going to cause you some problems, when in fact it will. The problem is that nobody does that with vitamin E pills, and people have a tendency to smoke a lot of cigarettes. And I think that fact should bear on the way that cigarettes are treated in advertising, and that the bar for fraud, because of that, is in a different place than it is, say, for instance, with bananas and potassium, or even with alcohol and liver damage. So I think there are degrees to which the use of a product, and given the way that people tend to use that product, bear on the kinds of laws that there should be. But the laws should always...
Is it not also fraud to say that a vaccine causes autism, when there's no scientific evidence that it does?
I think it is fraud to say that, it's not fraud to say a vaccine causes autism unless you're getting money, or unless there's an exchange. Fraud involves an exchange. I gave you something, you promised to give me something, and you didn't give me that thing. That's fraud. So fraud always involves an exchange of value for value, where, if I sell you a car and and I say it's got 60,000 miles on it, but I turn back the odometer and it's actually got 160,000 miles on it, and you give me $10,000, then I've committed fraud, because I got what I bargained for, but you didn't get what you bargained for.
So because nobody's making money out of it, you're okay with people lying in advertising?
Well, people lie all the time, and
not in advertising necessarily.
No.
That's why I think I share your concerns about the slippery slope. But I think if you just have a line that says advertising must be basically honest, I don't see how that could lead really to a slippery slope problem. I think that's a fairly set rule.
I think that advertising has to be honest in this sense. It has to be honest in the sense that I cannot misrepresent the product that I'm trying to get your money in exchange for, and then make that exchange on the basis of that misrepresentation. That's exactly what fraud is. And any instance of that, I think, should be illegal. And there are definitely some areas that are hard to determine exactly whether that has happened. And I grant you that there are, and that's, you know, that's why you have a whole field called the philosophy of law. That's a very complex field. I can't answer all of the hair splitting in there, but that has to be the zone of concern as far as I'm concerned. We've got to figure out when is it that fraud has been committed and when is it that it hasn't, because that, to my mind, has to be the bright line. So I grant you that it can be difficult at times, and is. And I think that if someone were to say, how would this work with autism? I'm trying to think of a way in which telling somebody a falsehood about, you know, vaccinations causing autism would constitute fraud.
Well, very often these people have got a book to sell or a website that requires money.
Yeah,
And, you know,
I suppose there might be some way. I'd have to think about it. I can't think offhand exactly, because just logging into my website, you know, paying me $5 to get behind my paywall, and back there I tell you that you know, vaccinations cause autism, and that's just factually not true, and I'm with you on that. But it doesn't strike me that I've given you that information per se in exchange for that. I gave you access. I'd have to think more about that. But I do think that we're in the right zone here to be thinking about it this way. This is my point. I can't answer every question about every law that might come up. I want to make the point that the bright line for law has to be force. And fraud is a form of force, and that's the form that we're trying to figure out the right answer to now with these products. Yes?
It's almost a follow-up on what you already talked about. I was in a restaurant with a friend, and we were kicked by something from the ceiling. None of us knew what it was. It was salt, because by law the restaurant couldn't have salt on the table. So they decided that since people were asking for salt all the time, they could have salt coming from the ceiling. People find ways.
What country was it?
It was in Latin America. Don't worry, it's not here. But people find ways to get what they want. But my point is, when you have the argument that the government does is usually not only that they need to make you aware, but that we're having a heavy cost on the NHS, protecting people from lung cancer, from alcohol problems, from salt, and maybe one day they could extend to mental problems. Therefore, we need to tax them, we need to heavily tax them, and you also need to make everybody working in advertising to be very, very much concerned, and probably not working with those brands that are highly, highly profitable. So my question is, if the government is making an argument based on health and the cost of the NHS, for instance, how would you argue against them?
Well, that's just really working, isn't it?
It's a very, very collectivist view, and when you really start thinking about it, it pretty much permits any form of government regulation of your lifestyle whatsoever. It also happens to be economically untrue most of the time, certainly in the case of smoking, certainly in the case of alcohol when you have large amounts of alcohol duty, and quite possibly also in the case of obesity, for the simple reason that although this argument is probably the most common argument you'll hear in favour of nanny state regulation, it only looks at one part of government spending, which is the health service. And it only takes a very partial look at that. So yeah, you can make a rough back of the envelope calculation of how many people get lung cancer as a result of smoking, how much that costs to treat, how many people get liver disease as a result of drinking, how much that costs to treat. You can top that up and have an annual total, which will be fairly large. What is never included in these studies, however, is the counterfactual of had these people never drunk, never smoked, what would they have died of, and how much would that cost to treat? Because people are going to die of something. And in actual fact, generally speaking, people who lead quote, healthier lives and live a long time tend to die of something that costs just as much as any kind of lifestyle-related disease would have cost. But over a longer period of time, have taken out a lot of welfare benefits, pensions, other health services, cataract operations, hip operations, all the stuff that you get when you're getting old. So it's quite well known in the economic literature, at least, that people dying younger as a result of anything, but certainly of alcohol or smoking or probably obesity-related diseases, actually saves government money in the round. If you look at the whole budget rather than just the health budget, if you look at the pensions, which is an enormous and expanding budget in Britain and most developed countries, Actually, you want people to die when they're about 65. That's the most efficient age at which people can die. After that, they are always taking out the pot. They're not putting anything in. So if it were a matter of economic efficiency, you would want the smoking rate to be 100%. But nobody is suggesting that, because actually they're not bothered about economic efficiency. They've got a moral problem with people smoking. That's really where it's coming from.
All right. I want to take issue with something there about if it were a matter of economic efficiency, it would be better for people to die at 65. This is all assuming that this is all because the government is involved in the marketplace, in the economy, right? The government is involved in healthcare and in, quote, health insurance, right? And if you get the government out of that, and it shouldn't be in there, because when the government is involved in those things, it is by that very fact using force against somebody. It's using force to either control businesses, or to take money from taxpayers to help this guy out versus that guy, or whatever the case may be. If you get the government out of the economy, then here's what's in everyone's economic interest: for people to live the longest, most happy lives they can. Why? Because if you remain alive, I can do more trading with you, and if you're dead, I can't. All right, just at just a simple level. So the reason that the government feels like it's got to be concerned about people's sugar intake and whether they're smoking cigarettes and whether they're doing this, that, and the other is largely because the government has gotten itself into the healthcare business, and now it's the nanny state taking care of everyone. And as you get older, we're going to have to be concerned about whether we've got to spend money on you in this way. But the government shouldn't be spending money on you in that way. The government shouldn't be spending money on you at all, except to simply protect your rights, and that doesn't require a whole lot of money, relatively speaking. The way that you should make decisions about your health care and your longevity of life and your quality of life is by thinking about what you want in life, contracting with private doctors and healthcare insurers and saying, well, okay, here's how much money I make, and here's what I'd like to have this kind of insurance because I'm concerned about this, and my mother had this disease and I might have it too. And so in other words, you use your mind based on your values and your future, and you use your money to establish healthcare and a retirement fund and anything else you want to do. Or you don't. And then that's your choice too. But for the government to get in, as soon as the government's involved, then you've lost choice. The government has to use force in order to manage this charade, and then they do, and then the government feels responsible for keeping you alive, and yeah, that's when it seems like the economically ideal age for you to die is 65. Well, that's obscene, but that obscenity only comes up because of the government's involvement in healthcare.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I basically agree with you, and the libertarian argument is always, we'll get the government out of healthcare and all this will go away. I think that is rather naive, because I think it takes this argument about economic costs at face value when I don't think it's ever really sincerely delivered. People will come up with all sorts of arguments to cover the fact that they're actually just Puritans. They think that people should be living the life that they think they should be living. And one of the most popular ones is this economic argument. I have explained, in probably hundreds of times, and I can back it up with any number of studies, that this is certainly not the case definitely with smoking and with alcohol, given how much alcohol duty we pay. I mean, somebody mentioned negative externalities before. The conventional way of dealing with a negative externality is with a tax. You work out what the price of the externality is, you put a tax on the product to balance it out, as it were, to internalize the externalities. We have done that many, many times over with alcohol and tobacco in this country. There is no question that teetotalers and non-smokers are being hugely subsidized by drinkers and smokers. And I've explained this time and time again to people who make this argument, and generally people get it. They understand actually that, yeah, if you look at things in the broader picture, actually these things are making money for the government rather than the other way around. But that never changes their mind about whether they should, whether we should be banning advertising for it or clamping down on it in some way, because it's not their real objection. You have to knock down quite a few different arguments with people sometimes before you get to what they really object to. In one case, I was explaining this to a guy who was talking about the cost of obesity, and I said, actually, probably obese people cost less than slim people. And he just said, oh, right, fair enough, but I still don't like fat people. And that's at least the truth, right? That's where it's really coming from most of the time. So actually getting rid of, I mean, not that I want the government involved in healthcare, but if the government wasn't involved in healthcare, people would very quickly come up with another justification.
does information becomes an advertisement? And especially, when does that advertisement of information, can that be considered an exchange that creates something negative for society? When I give out a personal idea, could that be correlated as if an organization would give an idea that is non-for-profit? What about whenever a corporation that has a profit wants to exchange that idea?
I think the bright line for when something is an advertisement is when the information, whatever form it's coming in, whether concepts or pictures or whatever, is intended to sell a product. The purpose of advertising is to sell products or services. And so I think that's simply the bright line there. Are you trying to sell a product or service with this information or not? If you are, then it's either marketing or advertising or something along those lines. I think maybe the bright line on advertising within the broader marketing sphere is when it's a delimited, specific, either poster or short video that's played on television or on the internet or something like that. That would probably be where the concept of advertisement would differ from the broader term of marketing. Would you say yes to that roughly?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that there are two reasons why advertising should be held to a higher standard than what you or I say in the street. One is, as you mentioned, the fact that someone is making money out of it. It does open up the opportunity for fraud. But the other thing is that advertising is kind of the uninvited guest in your home. It's different to other forms of speech in that it is pushed into the public space on the back of large amounts of money. I think that does make it different to just holding an opinion, which, as I said before, I think it should be totally uncensored.
What if it's a political opinion? What if the information is an idea or an ideology? And what if that ideology is not mainstream, like objectivism, but to the other standard, anarcho-capitalism? Or any ideology that people might consider it to be legitimately erroneous, fraudulent, divisive, and counterproductive.
Yeah, well, that's the danger of regulating it too much and regulating ideas. I mean, you get this occasionally when groups put messages on London buses. There was one quite a few years ago about God probably doesn't exist, get over it. And obviously a lot of religious people found that objectionable. There was another one quite recently, I can't remember what it was about, abortion or something like that. But you get these things which, some people just don't like the message. They find it offensive. And I think when it is, as I say, when it's being pushed into the public space, that does make it a different issue to just standing at Hyde Park and ranting on about whatever you want. But I would be very cautious about regulating that kind of speech if the only objection is that people find it offensive or it goes against their beliefs or it's a minority viewpoint. I think the objectivists should be allowed to put out billboards promoting objectivism, regardless of who it offends, and the same for Muslims or Christians or atheists.
I think say a couple words on that too. What you're talking about, when an ideological group putting their ideas out there, I think that's stepping outside the realm of advertising per se. I think advertising is a more specific form of speech, but that's still speech. It's still a matter of speech, and it's still protected under what I keep coming back to as I think should be the bright line. You're either using physical force, fraud, or extortion or the like against someone, or you're not. If you're not, then whatever you're doing should be legal. So if you're just advocating ideas, whether you're advocating objectivism or whether you're advocating Islam or whether you're advocating anything else, if it's just the ideas, there's no legitimate grounds for the government to regulate that in any way, shape, or form, in my view.
Is it also efficient, meaning to combat those ideologies that many of them can be pretty unnecessary or pretty stupid? Is it efficient in a practical way despite of the ethics and morality?
Efficient to spread ideas that way or to...
People could have political advertisement in London buses, and many of them turn out to be fraudulent and counterproductive, like the $300 million from the NHS for Brexit.
Yeah.
Should that be actually, is that efficient? Because
by
advocating a moral stance, you're promoting, well, you're not promoting, but you're creating a free market for under under desirability.
All right, the subways raise another issue because the problem with the subways is that they're public. If the subways were private, the answer to the question, should this advertisement be permitted in the subway, would be very easy. You go to the owner and you go, do you want this advertisement in your subway? I realize that, but I just want to I want to draw another bright line, because as soon as public property is introduced to the equation, it becomes impossible to draw completely clear and rights-protecting answers, because you've already stepped over the line. This goes to the issue of principles I was talking about. As soon as you say we're going to have public property, you're already on a slippery slope. The government's already in the economy by nature of the fact that public property exists. It allegedly belongs to all of us, but because of that it belongs to no one, and therefore it's impossible to say objectively what's going to happen on this property. So this is why I advocate laissez-faire capitalism. It's the system where all property is private and individual rights are protected as a matter of course. Now I know that some people think that that's, we're too far away from that kind of a thing to make that our goal, but I don't think we can move in any direction sensibly unless we have an ultimate goal that we think is in principle right. So I think it's good to keep that in mind. It's not going to help us solve all of these problems right away, but it helps us understand why we can't solve them all right away, which is helpful psychologically and also helpful in terms of intellectual activism, to know that we're not failing because we can't think clearly enough. We're failing because the government is involved in things that the government should not be involved in, and that causes all sorts of problems that are inherently unsolvable until we get government out of the economy. Do you have a question?
Earlier, I agree with most of the things that you said, but one thing really stuck out that I thought was interesting. Earlier you made the most brilliant, compelling argument in favour of banning advertising I've ever heard. If we didn't have advertising, we wouldn't be able to have Facebook. Yes. So,
well, you don't have to have Facebook. I don't use it.
Actually, that's my point. That's exactly. I would happily pay them money to stay out of my life and my family's life. And I can't do that. I shouldn't have to, because that's extortion. There are so many things that are not entirely transparent, and the contract between a consumer and a producer, whether that contract's either dishonest or it's not entirely clear. Or you have somebody who's a psychology graduate that employs lots of very, very sophisticated people that understand insight into human behavior and track that and optimize that in a way to form a very manipulative, contrived, the opposite of clear and it's not a contract that a normal, reasonable person can even expect to be able to. If you look at the privacy controls in Facebook, and the way they've changed them, that's designed not to be understood. When I saw all those dials and all, you realize the complex. Geez, I'm a computer scientist and I can't fathom what the hell any of these. But all those combinations. This is designed not to be understood. And as a consumer, I know what I should do. There's the OK button, and there's the later button, and there's the button in my mind what I'd like to do. Walk away, never deal with it again. But
do it. So I did.
Yeah,
just do it.
It's very difficult. It will track you everywhere, and your family will. The network effect. It is designed to suck you back in. I never paid them any money, and there's always that pressure to get you back in, and it's.
You're still talking about Facebook here?
Well, they're the worst, except that there are many social media companies that are not clear, not as transparent as they could be in relationships, but the worst by far that I've seen is Facebook.
What is it that you want to know from Facebook that you can't find out?
I'd like them to not, if I don't sign up to them and I don't use their services, I would like them not to create shadow profiles of me based on other people's. For example, if other people in my family take photographs, if I go to a wedding and I get photographed and tagged and they build up I'm in, like 5 other people in my family are in it, and their address books get sucked up invisibly. They've agreed to these very complicated terms. But then they're not going to. These people are not lawyers. Normal people are not lawyers. They're not going to read through pages and pages of contracts with Facebook. Oh, by the way, we're going to inhale all your contacts and start profiling everybody that you talk to, and measure how often do you talk to them or what relationship they are to you. I never opted into it. I never agreed to be part of that. And I'm not a consumer in that sense of what they're doing. I'm stunned by the hostility. It's taken me a while to realise how aggressive and hostile that appears to be.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not on Facebook. I got off it a few years ago. Just I found it annoying, not because of my privacy issues. And I can only recommend other people do that if they don't like what they're doing. But I think a lot of the concern about the so-called tech giants is massively overcooked, mainly by cynical newspapers who are sick of organisations like Facebook eating all their advertising. So it comes back to advertising again. I personally don't have a problem with it. I know I use Twitter a lot, and Twitter is addictive, and they're always changing the algorithms to make it more addictive. And well, fine, and if they want to change things in it to make it more enjoyable, which is all it really means, then they are more than welcome to do it. In fact, I thank them for it, and it's great that it's a free service. You hear a lot of kind of pseudo-scientific nonsense about how they change their technology around and how they get everything calibrated perfectly to stimulate dopamine in your brain. Anyone who talks about stimulating dopamine in the brain is usually misleading you. I mean, dopamine is meant to be released in the brain when you experience pleasure. There is nothing wrong with organisations making their services more pleasurable. That's exactly what they should be doing. And any form of government regulation to clamp down on this kind of thing, which looks fairly imminent now, will essentially just make these things less enjoyable. That's all it will really mean. If you don't like the way Facebook shares your data, or you're concerned about the transparency of it, which I think is reasonable, then get off it. But I don't know if it actually causes any actual harm. I mean, there's lots of things going on underneath the surface, but all it seems to mean is that people like you keep going back to it, even though you theoretically hate it.
I have to plead with family members to not do things in it.
Not do things what?
I have to plead with family, I have to educate family members and kind of control them to not put things on there.
I'm a little unclear about how, so I don't think that Facebook can in any way suck in your...
They have done that with people's contacts.
Well, like with people who sign up for Facebook, and then in some way... It
affects people indirectly.
Okay.
If you have people, suppose you have somebody that's had a domestic violence breakup, they're hiding from their violent partner or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They move to a different city and they definitely don't want their violent ex-spouse to find out where they live and that type of a thing.
Yeah.
You have some data you really don't want getting back on the internet. And if you're in somebody else's address book, and that address book gets pulled into Facebook, and Facebook is obviously loves to connect everything to everything else.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to keep track of all the services that are in there. You don't even need to use it to innovate. And
you can show up in there. I see what your point is. Okay, well, I would think, first of all, as technology and economics progress, and as human beings create more different kinds of values that we can use to make our lives wonderful, law gets more complex. New situations come up, and we've got to figure out how to deal with them. And the situations come up before we figure out how to deal with them. That's the order, right? But I would think of it this way. It's not too different from situations we've already had, and I think that law will catch up and figure out the best ways to deal with it. But think about Facebook just this way for a moment. Think about it as a park where there's a parade going on. You go to the park and there's a parade and somebody's taking pictures. And you wind up inadvertently in a picture, and that picture gets put someplace, and you didn't opt for that picture to be taken, but you did opt to go to the park. And now that picture is taken, and somebody can say, oh, there's Jason or whomever, and maybe it would be an ex who was trying to find you, and now she knows that you live in, or that you were at that park that day, or whatever. It's not too far off. It's the same kind of situation, yet that existed before Facebook existed.
On a smaller scale.
On a smaller scale, but part of living is that you step out into the world and you make choices. If you're going to go into this department store, you're going to be seen in that department store. If you're going to go onto Facebook, you're going to be seen on Facebook. And if you go onto the internet at all, you're going to be seen on the internet sometimes in ways that you might not know or want to be seen. And you can't, there's no way to coordinate off the world and the elements of reality so that you can only ever be seen where you want to be seen. But it just doesn't work that way, because you're kind of stomping your foot at reality if you do that. So I think you have to be at peace with the fact that as technology moves on, we kind of have to roll with the punches. And again, if we stick with the bright line about where to draw, where to create laws and where not to, and that is at the violation of rights, then we can keep figuring things out in the best way possible. If we cross that line, all hell breaks loose, which it has here and it has in the United States, and to extremes it has in North Korea. And if we want that, we can keep moving that direction. Or we can go back in the right direction, which is to get government the hell out of everything we can get it out of. Yes?
Just to your point on the whole Facebook tracking, the guy who made the question, I work in digital advertising. We do all kind of crazy targeting that you might imagine that you might not. And essentially what Craig said is when you're in the internet or when you're in a public space, they don't diverge. What you need to do in the internet, as you would do it as going in the park, is wear a mask. And obviously wearing a mask on a computer is much harder than wearing a mask in public. But the internet is essentially a public space, and every time you connect to that network, you'll be sending off signals to everybody who has interest. Every time you connect in a public space Wi-Fi, you're giving away your data in exchange for that, and someone will be tracking your device ID to see where you have been. And advertisers don't do that in a way that they want to track you and know where you are on an NSA style kind of thing. It's more about they want to show you rather than ads based on your behaviors, and that's all that people talk at least at the basic levels, and that's what the engineers at Facebook are probably trying to do. So to your point, when you share your phone with someone, you inadvertently share that, and they will use as they please. So it's in their calendar or in their contact book, and they will inadvertently upload and share them. It's like when someone spilled the beans on some gossip. There are consequences to that, and I don't see it as it is a different arena than the real world. What it is that we don't yet have full understanding of the implications of our actions, because it is a lot more complex, and people are not educated enough to realize what they're engaging with. Because every time you go on any website that is not a completely shut down website, that doesn't have any advertising, it will simply connect back to the whole dispersed matrix of the internet, so to speak. It will be Facebook, Google, and everyone else who's advertising online.
Yeah, I mean, to take it back to advertising, they want this data, as you say, primarily just so they can give you targeted ads. And I think targeted ads are great. It makes the advertising industry a hell of a lot more efficient. And it actually makes advertising better for punters. People, like I said to begin with, people don't really feel that strongly about advertising. People maybe see it as a necessary evil, or they find it a bit annoying. The main reason a lot of people want to ban these gambling adverts seems to be just that there's too many of them and they find them annoying. It's not about problem gambling, it's just I'm sick of seeing Ray Winston telling me to gamble. But target ads are a good thing. People are not generally that interested in advertising. They find a lot of the adverts annoying. Some of them, like Go Compare, are deliberately designed to be annoying so that you remember them. But your ears prick up every now and again when you see an advert for something you want. So you can pick up the paper day after day and see all the useless advertising for property, and then one day you want to buy a house and it suddenly becomes really interesting. So with targeted advertising, it basically just means that hopefully most of the advertising is of interest to you. So yeah, great. I'm pretty laid back about sharing that kind of information with organisations like Facebook. And I suspect most people probably are, but if you're not, just get off it. Go to MySpace. You can get peace and quiet there.
I'd like to just piggyback on his point there and emphasize this too. Targeted advertising is really an objective value for us if you think about it. You can now, instead of having all these ads keep coming at you that have no relevance to your life, you can click on a little thing and say, I don't want to see this kind of ad anymore. It's not relevant to my life. And at least on Facebook, you can do this. Now, I'm not saying that that everything is hunky-dory out there, but advertisers don't want to keep spending money to put ads in front of you that you are not going to act on either. They don't want that either. They want to put ads in front of you that you might act on, and the only way they can do that is by figuring out what things you might actually find value in. Well, it's good to know what things you might find value in. If I'm shopping for a new shirt, and there's a shirt company I've bought a shirt from in the past, then that shirt company knows, well, he kind of likes our style. And if it's another shirt company that has a style I don't like, maybe it's all, skin tight stuff, I don't wear that stuff. So that shirt company, I can say, don't show me those anymore. And there's a real value to all of this that I think it's easy to lose sight of. And knowing what's out there and knowing what might make your life better is good. That's a good thing to know. That's good information.
I wanted to add one point that might seem a bit more contentious than just advertising. Let's say if you put up a lot of things on the internet, like let's say you attending parties or whatever, where it might be assumed that you're drinking a lot of alcohol or something, or otherwise, let's say posting on Instagram that you're jogging all the time. I think there are certain, let's say, health insurance type of services that will affect the type of premiums that they're going to be offering you based on this data. And what bothers me a lot about it is that it's not very conclusive data that they're working with, and so they're making a lot of assumptions. Still not something that I really would like to have very regularly.
But it is in their interest over time to make that data stronger and better, because they have a service, and look, if you don't buy insurance from them, you're going to buy it from someone else. Their best bet is to figure out who's a good possible customer for us given our business model and the type of insurance that we're selling. And you want the win-win situation. You want an insurance company that has the kind of policy you want and that has the factual information on you so that you both get something out of this. So I grant you that at times the information that a company is operating with is not ideal. They don't have as much information. But for the most part, companies are groping to try to get the best information that they can. The travel of information out there, factual information, to the extent that we can get it out, it's all good.
And if they weren't making assumptions based on that kind of stuff, they'd only be making even broader assumptions based on something else.
Yeah.
Just crude data on where you live, how old you are, what gender you are, and a lot of the time that can be completely wrong. You might be, a young man who's an excellent driver, for example. Chloe.
Yes.
It's more in relation to the question that maybe she's gone now, asked about body image issues. Just another point to add to that, Jonathan Haidt wrote about this in the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, about the increase in mental health issues for young women. And they found that it wasn't necessarily seeing very good-looking women on TV that was impacting them. It was Instagram and the filter and seeing their friends look enhanced. So that comparable to their own social group, they felt insufficient, which is really interesting, which leads me to believe that I think some of these issues might be more about people's relationships with their cohort than maybe companies creating these issues. And I think there is a tendency to look at a problem like increased mental health problems with young women and young men and think that there's a simple solution to it, but I think it's possibly more down to the instinct to want to have high status at that age and the impact that social media has on that.
It's a very good point. I meant to say that in my response to it, but yeah, I mean, he makes a pretty strong claim actually about the rise of mental health, that he says it's all down to smartphones, and you can track exactly the year that it all kicked off with the smartphones. And he may well be right. I don't know. I think it's certainly not. The evidence is far from conclusive, but it does certainly seem to be been a rise in mental health problems, particularly amongst young women from around about 2013. And if it has got something to do with smartphones, firstly, we're not going to ban smartphones. So this is just another example of, well, there might be a link, but that doesn't mean you ban it. And secondly, it is, like you say, probably much more to do with people sharing their own thoughts and photos and videos and ideas than it is with seeing a bit of advertising for. I mean, I think it's pretty rare, isn't it, these days when you have very skinny women in advertising? I don't know. It seemed to me like.
It's still incredibly useful. But you know,
Well, they're good, but you can't. Let's not ban that.
They're trying to sell things, you know.
but he was saying there's a difference between seeing an advert with an incredibly beautiful woman and knowing, yeah, that's what models are. But then seeing your friends with a filter looking a lot better.
Yeah.
And there was a difference in the impact on your self-esteem, apparently.
These people who use filters on their photos are terrible.
I would like to respond to this too, because I have a point that I think goes to a deeper level that's really important on this. Girls who are seeing their friends on Instagram and feeling like they're in some way inferior because their friend is either prettier or used a filter that made her look prettier or whatever, they don't just have a problem with their relationships with their friends. They have a problem with the relationship with themselves. And this is where we really need to focus on things, and not just with young girls, but with young boys and with everyone. Ayn Rand made a really important distinction between what she called a first-hander and a second-hander. And a first-hander is someone who is focused on reality, on his own goals, on what he can figure out with his mind, on the things that he or she regards as important to his or her life. And it doesn't mean that they're not at all concerned with other people, but they don't put other people first. It's not their first concern is what do other people think, or what do other people look like, or what are other people wearing, or whatever. But because children today are raised with such a collectivist mentality, both in the schools, you know, it's always, the group is more important than the individual, or in society, the group is typically regarded as more important than the individual. We're always told, sacrifice for the greater good. There's something more important than you. Who are you to judge? You know, these kinds of things. Your mind is not necessarily capable of judging. That's all wrong. We should be telling children, your life is the most important thing properly to you. Your mind is how you make judgments of this world. What you think is good for your life is where you need to put your focus. And your friends should be secondary to that. You should not concern yourself with what your friends think of you. You should concern yourself with what you think of yourself, and you should constantly strive to make yourself better in your eyes, not in the eyes of others. And that's what a first-hander does, and a second-hander turns to other people and places their judgment, their values, what they want, what they think is important in first place. And if we can learn to raise children and to advocate individualism in the soul versus collectivism in the soul, that's where we can really help kids. That's where we can make a big change that doesn't require government forcing advertisers not to do things, or forcing Instagram to change its algorithms or whatever. Instead, you raise kids with the idea that, look, your life and your mind and your values, that's what matters most. Don't put other people's values first. Put your values first. And I'll really advocate this. Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, is themed on this very idea. It's individualism versus collectivism in the soul of the individual. That's the theme of the novel. And it's so powerful. And if kids were to read this novel when they were in their teens, it would have a tremendous effect culturally on the way that they approach Instagram. They would still go to Instagram, and they might even still see pictures of their friends with filters having been used. But they wouldn't think, oh, I'm now inferior because look at this other person. They would instead think, oh, Jennifer looks beautiful with that filter she used. How wonderful, right? It would just be a completely different attitude. So I think we need to meet this problem where it really manifests, and that's in the soul of kids when they're entering their teens. Yes.
That then extends to kind of employees in companies, advertising companies, who are kind of so the advertising companies, not the brand. They're essentially the broker. They're the professional persuaders. And they've moved into this industry because they're really interested in human behaviour, or they're interested in the technology. But let's focus on the people that care about behaviour change and are quite kind of socially minded. And that's quite typical of the industry, that you're interested in how humans make decisions. So you're that person, you're working in an advertising company, and you're the voice box for brands, so they come and pay you to share their messages. So So you have a big role in the way people behave in all sorts of different ways around the world. But you've got no connection to the, I suppose, or very little connection to, I suppose, this idea of like where the self-correction might happen. So your only goal is going to be to kind of hit the KPI of kind of more products sold, more people convinced that this product will be good for their life. You know, do we owe it? Do we owe it to those individuals to boost their self-esteem so that they can make good choices as part of their role? I'm not talking about regulation at all. I'm talking about how we help people make good decisions who have like an excess of control, an excess of influence, really, much more than I have.
I think certainly if you can have an effect on people, so if somebody's got a key position in a company where he or she is controlling, in effect, what kind of advertising goes out, and if you can get that person to recognize truths about human life and human nature that they're unaware of, or correct thoughts that they have that are false. So if that person thinks that it's a good idea to feed on kids' collectivist ideas, and so let's do more of that, and maybe she's doing that. Well, I would rather her not do that. So I would rather her read The Fountainhead also, and maybe try to appeal to the grain of individualism that kids might still have left in their souls, and try to make that a selling point, right? I think we can do this, but we can't do it if we don't try, right? And I for one, I actually am really concerned about youths, and I would like them to not feel rotten because somebody looks this way in an ad or somebody looks that way on Instagram. I would love for youths to get to the stage by the time they're in adolescence where they're like, hey, I'm at peace with myself. I use my mind, I go after my values, I take whatever body shape I was born with, and I do the best with that, I keep myself healthy. We can be positive in this way and help children to think this way also, and then hopefully help more adults to think that way. And if everybody starts thinking this way, we overcome many of these problems.
I suppose my worry is that that we put a lot of faith really in people who are working towards KPIs and targets in companies and who are good at persuading, and that's why they're doing it. To persuade, that they're going to fight as equally for us to buy one product as the next, no matter what its impact on our lives is. And it just feels like it's a big responsibility for them, and for that to go unchecked or unsupported.
Well, I would say...
I'm curious, I just really would be interested in your views on it. I don't really know how to articulate it. But
I think I know what you're saying. I just think, in general, people need to chill out about advertising, because it's not, it's just not that powerful. There are a huge number of products that get launched every year, often with quite big advertising campaigns, which just disappear. Particularly in the food industry, you get thousands of new products all the time, and the vast majority of them disappear. If advertising could make people buy things, then companies would spend much more on advertising than they do. The average ad spend is kind of 1 or 2% most of revenue. If advertising had so much power that it could really not just increase market share, but increase overall aggregates, the size of the overall market, companies would be spending as much as they possibly could. They'd be spending half the budget on it. The reality is that a lot of it doesn't work at all, and they know that. And at the end of the day, the most an advertisement can do is make you try a product. And if you don't like it, you'll never buy it again. But that is the absolute best case scenario for the advertising industry. If you just get someone to try the product, but thereafter, the product has to sell itself. So I just don't think advertising, like I said, in line with what Julian Simon said, it's not really worth that much attention. I know you spent the entire afternoon discussing him, but that's how Julian Simon felt after several years. It's not that big a deal. People make far too much of it. It's very important if you're in an advertising company. It's pretty important if you're a business that's launching a new brand. But consumers just need to relax about it, really. It gives us lots of free stuff, and that's good.
That's just it for me, because I do see it from the advertising company's perspective, because I work with advertising companies.
Right.
Looking at their social contracts. So I'm interested in kind of the fact that as an industry, if you talk to advertisers about what their responsibility is, they say, well, we just do what the client tells us to do. And the client says, well, we just do what consumers want us to do, or feed off what they believe already. And so it kind of seems like there's a vacuum of sort of values, really.
Well, there may well be. I mean, but that doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because the advertising agencies do what the client wants, and they're probably trying to inject as much creativity and intelligence into it as they can. But if you actually look, if any of you going back on the tube or the bus, look at the ads that are around you. Although there are some high-profile adverts, some of the Guinness adverts, everyone goes, oh, very clever, wonderful, isn't it, brilliant? Yeah, the Cadbury's monkey drummer, people go, this is great. But the vast majority of adverts, even quite expensive TV campaigns, are not really informed much different to what they were like in the late 19th century. They generally just tell you what the product is, how much it is, and where you can get hold of it, and probably what the main selling point is. The features and benefits. At most, that is generally what you get. For very well-known brands like Coke and Guinness, they can get away with barely showing the product at all. They just have to remind you that product is still out there. We're still here. Don't forget about us. Stick with us. But for most advertising, it's actually pretty straightforward. It just tells you what it is, what it's going to do for you, how much it is, and where you can get it. And so the advertising industry has a huge incentive to make it sound like there's much more to it than there really is, and it's much more powerful than it really is. But actually, it's pretty straightforward. What you see is pretty much what you get. You don't look convinced, but
because we don't have time for any more questions.
No, I don't have anything to add other than to reiterate just what I started with, which is that advertising is an integral part of the production side of the economy. It's important because when people build products, if you don't know those products exist or that product changes have been made that might be of interest to you, then you can't get that value. You don't have that value until you have the information. The information is important, and that's what advertising does. It's a good thing for the most part. It doesn't mean that bad can't be done there, but we need to produce, we need to trade, and we need to consume. That's what the economy is all about. And advertising is a huge and vital part of that. So I think it should be celebrated, and it should be looked at far more positively than it is.
I can just put a plug in for this. This is an abridged version of one of the very first books the IA ever published in the late 1950s. I abridged it a few years ago, give it a new introduction. There is one hard copy here if anybody wants it, but you can download it for free. It's called Advertising in a Free Society, and I think it's got pretty much everything you need to know about advertising in it.
Awesome.
And you can take that one, leave it on the table.
And guys, please.
I don't want to take a copy because I want them to have it.
Yeah,
I would like one at some point.
This topic and the demand for regulation is not going anywhere, but neither are we. So we will explore this topic.
Take it if you want. Take it if you want.
Okay. And by the way,